Imagine waking one morning to find your body betraying you. Your hands tremble as if controlled by invisible strings. Your breath comes in shallow gasps, and your mind, once clear, clouds with confusion. Every ache, every struggle, every limitation seems to come not from accident or illness, but from a truth buried deep within your very blood. A truth that is not your fault, yet will define the rest of your life. Now imagine learning that this truth began long before your birth, with ancestors who valued their power more than your health, their dynasty more than your humanity. A father who was also an uncle, a mother who was also a cousin, a grandmother who was simultaneously your great-aunt. The family tree no longer branches but coils back upon itself like a snake devouring its own tail. This is not a Gothic fable. It was the reality for countless women born into the great dynasties of Europe. They were heirs to crowns, palaces, and empires, but also to genetic chains that bound them tighter than any prison cell. These were women raised not as individuals with dreams, but as pawns in a game of dynastic survival, where love was irrelevant and lineage was everything. To understand their lives, we must first understand the obsession that created their suffering, the belief that blood itself carried divine authority. In the courts of Europe, especially by the 16th century, nobility did not merely see themselves as rulers by chance. They believed their blood was different, purer, sanctified by God himself. This belief was so powerful that marriages were no longer about companionship or even alliances. They became strategies of self-preservation. To mix blood with commoners was unthinkable. To mix blood with one's own relatives, however, was not only acceptable but celebrated as a safeguard of royal purity. Thus began a centuries-long gamble against nature itself. Cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces, brothers gave their sisters as brides to foreign thrones, and over time, as if history itself demanded balance, the power they fought so hard to preserve corroded from within their veins. The very purity they prized became poison. No dynasty embodied this paradox more clearly than the Habsburgs. With domains stretching across Austria, Spain, Burgundy, and beyond, the Habsburg family believed their union with one another was stronger than any army. Let others wage wars, they boasted. You happy Austria, marry. And marry they did so frequently within their own blood that, within a few generations, their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a twisted knot. But behind the grand portraits, the gilded crowns, and the resplendent palaces, reality told another story. The heirs of this dynasty carried within their faces and bodies the unmistakable marks of inbreeding. The infamous Habsburg jaw, spines bent under invisible burdens, fragile bodies unable to carry life to term, and minds tormented by melancholy, obsession, or madness. What makes these stories all the more haunting is how visible the truth was. Court painters immortalized young princesses with delicate features that already bore the shadow of deformity. Physicians, sworn to preserve the royal body, kept meticulous records of strange ailments repeating generation after generation. And yet, the marriages continued. Why? Because power demanded it. The health of daughters and wives was a secondary concern to the survival of the dynasty. It is here, in the dim candlelit halls of Vienna, that our first figure emerges. A little girl born in 1634 who would never run in gardens without pain, never eat without struggle, never breathe without effort. Her name was Maria Anna of Austria, and her life would become a living testimony to the curse of bloodline purity. But before we step into her chamber, we must pause on a disturbing realization. These women were not outliers, not rare accidents. They were part of a pattern that spanned centuries, a tapestry of suffering woven by the choices of kings, queens, and the relentless weight of tradition. To tell their stories is not to revel in tragedy, but to confront the uncomfortable truth. Entire empires were built on the sacrifice of women, whose only crime was to be born into a family that valued lineage more than life itself. And so, as we open the curtain on Maria Anna's brief and sorrowful existence, we do more than recall one woman's pain. We step into the shadowed inheritance of a dynasty that chose to challenge nature itself, and in doing so, condemned its daughters to bear the cost. Vienna, 1634. In the grand echoing corridors of the Hofburg Palace, bells toll quietly to announce the birth of a new archduchess. Courtiers smile, couriers hurry through the streets, and prayers of gratitude rise toward heaven. Another Habsburg child has entered the world, a daughter of emperors, born into silks, jewels, and ceremony. Her name, Maria Anna of Austria. Yet, even as she draws her first breaths, The curse of her bloodline coils unseen around her tiny frame. She has inherited not merely a crown, but the accumulated weight of generations of choices made in candlelit council chambers, marriage contracts sealed with signatures and holy vows. The Habsburg family, who had bound itself so tightly to its own blood, had passed along more than wealth and titles. They had passed along fragility. From her earliest years, Maria Anna knew her body was not like that of other children. While her playmates darted across palace gardens with careless laughter, she struggled to walk without pain. Her spine curved unnaturally, forcing her into a posture that strained her lungs and left her gasping after even the smallest exertion. Her jaw, the unmistakable Habsburg hallmark, jutted forward so prominently that eating became an exhausting ordeal. Servants cut her meat into morsels no bigger than peas, yet still she labored to chew and swallow, each meal an exercise in patience and embarrassment. But physical pain, however constant, was only part of her burden. Far heavier was the mirror of ancestry that surrounded her. In gilded halls, portraits of her forebears gazed down, uncles with the same protruding jaw, grandmothers with bent spines, cousins pale and sickly, all immortalized in paint. For Maria Anna, these were not distant ancestors. They were reflections of herself, reminders that her suffering was not random but inherited, repeated endlessly in the family's determination to preserve its blood. The court physicians visited often, armed with quills and grim expressions. They poked and prodded, noting the angle of her spine, the tension of her jaw, the weakness of her limbs. To them, she was not a girl but a case, a specimen that proved what whispered rumors already suggested. The Habsburg line was unraveling from within, but never did they name it aloud in her presence. Instead they spoke of mysterious humors, of God's will, of ailments beyond comprehension. Yet Maria Anna, sharp-minded and perceptive, understood more than they realized. The curse was not divine. It was deliberate, born of choices made by people who had valued political strength over human life. Her mind, keen, restless, almost rebellious, became her only refuge. While her body betrayed her daily, her intellect flourished. She devoured books in hidden chambers, losing herself in worlds where marriage meant love rather than strategy, where children were born healthy and unburdened, where family trees branched freely instead of coiling in suffocating circles. Within those pages she discovered freedom, though only in imagination. But palace life was not kind to women whose bodies bore the obvious marks of inbreeding. Suitors came and went, each introduced with smiles and promises of alliances. Yet the moment her deformities revealed themselves, negotiations faltered, agreements dissolved into silence. Even in a Europe accustomed to cousin marrying cousin, Maria Anna's condition was too severe to overlook. To her, rejection became as predictable as the rising of the Sunday. She would never wed, not by choice, but by exclusion. Loneliness grew heavier with each passing year. In the hush of her chambers, curtains drawn to block the gaze of outsiders, Maria Anna lived surrounded by attendants yet starved of companionship. She was both royal and forgotten, valuable enough to be studied, but not enough to be cherished. For a woman whose life had been predetermined by others, even the smallest act of independence, a choice of book, a fleeting moment of quiet thought, became an act of defiance. By her early 30s, her fragile body could endure no more. Organs weakened, lungs failing, heart strained. Maria Anna's body surrendered at just 32 years of age. Her death certificate listed ailments: fever, weakness, perhaps pneumonia. But the true cause, the one unrecorded, was written in her very DNA. She died because her ancestors had chosen power over mercy, bloodline over compassion. Her passing drew brief mourning in court, but what was lamented was not her lost potential as a woman, nor the quiet resilience she had shown despite her suffering. Instead, courtiers lamented the failure of yet another link in the fragile Habsburg chain. A dynasty had lost a pawn, not a daughter. And yet, in her silent rooms filled with books and longing, Maria Anna had left behind something more enduring than her bloodline. She became the embodiment of a truth her ancestors had refused to see, that power hoarded at the cost of humanity is a curse, not a blessing. Her short life, defined by pain, revealed a dynasty's darkest secret, a secret that would echo through generations of women yet to be born. Castile, 1479. A princess is born into one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. Her parents are none other than Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the monarchs who would unite Spain, drive out Muslims and Jews, and fund Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic. Their daughter, Joanna of Castile, was born not merely to privilege but to destiny. Intelligent, well-educated, fluent in multiple languages, Joanna was the very model of a Renaissance princess. To all appearances, she carried the promise of greatness. But beneath her fine gowns and polished manners lay a truth written in her bloodline. Her parents, though celebrated rulers, were also cousins. Their marriage had united kingdoms, but it had also reinforced the tangled web of genetic ties that bound Europe's royal houses. For Joanna, this meant that from her first breath, her life would be shaped by the heavy shadow of inherited fragility. As a young woman, Joanna showed no signs of instability. On the contrary, she was admired for her intelligence and grace. But like so many royal daughters, her future was not her own. She was wed to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a union meant to secure political alliances between Spain and the Habsburgs. It was a marriage of power, not affection, and from the very beginning, it became a battlefield. Philip was as faithless as he was handsome, cold, manipulative, constantly seeking the company of other women. For Joanna, raised to believe that her highest duty was to her husband and her role as mother of heirs, this betrayal struck at the very core of her being. Her love for Philip, far from fading, grew obsessive, as though her entire sense of self depended on his fidelity. To courtiers, her grief and jealousy looked like madness, but was it truly madness? Or was it the desperate anguish of a woman trapped in a system where her only worth lay in the loyalty of a husband who scorned her? The breaking point came in 1506. Philip, still young and vigorous, died suddenly, some say of illness, others whispered poison. For Joanna, the shock was unbearable. Her grief became a dark spiral from which she could not emerge. She refused to bury his body, insisting instead on traveling across Spain with his coffin. At each stop, she ordered the casket opened, pressed her lips against his decaying face, and wept as though he were still alive. The sight horrified those around her, and the legend of Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, was born. But madness is often a convenient label. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles V, both saw political opportunity in her condition. A woman branded insane could not rule. A queen declared unfit could be locked away, her power transferred to others. And so Joanna, a legitimate monarch in her own right, spent the next 46 years confined within the walls of the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The confinement was not gentle. She was kept in cold, dark chambers, denied proper food, deprived of warmth or dignity. Servants reported her tearing her clothes, going weeks without bathing, screaming into the silence. These accounts, preserved in court records, painted her as hopelessly insane. But modern historians look back with doubt. What they see is a woman suffering from severe depression, from post-traumatic grief, from decades of enforced isolation conditions that would break even the strongest mind. Nor could the genetic factor be ignored. Mental illness, melancholy, and anxiety appeared again and again in the Habsburg family tree, passed from parent to child with each generation of cousin marriage. Joanna's own descendants, her daughter Catherine of Portugal, her son Charles, and others showed the same patterns of instability. Was Joanna truly mad? Or was she simply another casualty of both circumstance and inheritance, her vulnerability exposed by the brutal indifference of politics? She died in 1555, still imprisoned, still labelled the Mad. By then she had been erased from public life for decades, her name surviving only in whispers. The chronicles of her time record her less as a queen and more as a curiosity, a warning, an embarrassment. Yet behind the title of madness lay a deeper truth. Joanna had been denied not just her throne but her humanity. Her tragedy speaks not only to the cruelty of genetics, but to the cruelty of power. A system that prized dynastic control above all else found it useful to call her insane, to silence her voice, to lock her away until death delivered her to obscurity. Whether or not Joanna was ever truly mad matters less than this. She was a woman undone by forces larger than herself, her bloodline, her marriage, her family's ambitions. And so the story of Joanna of Castile lingers like an unsettled question. Was she mad, or was she made mad? Was she broken by her genes, or by the walls that confined her? Perhaps she was both, a woman whose suffering revealed the cost of dynastic ambition more clearly than any royal decree ever could. Madrid, 1651. A baby girl is born in the royal palace of Spain. She is named Margaret Teresa, daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria. Even before her first breath, her destiny has been decided, her future mapped by the ink of dynastic contracts. She is not merely a child but a vessel her body already promised to secure the fragile balance of Europe's thrones. Her childhood, unusually for a royal princess, is vividly preserved for us in paint. The brush of Diego Velázquez, court painter to the Spanish kings, immortalized her in a series of portraits that today hang in museums across the world. In them we see a child surrounded by dwarfs, ladies in waiting, and towering attendants. Her gowns are stiff with brocade, her hair styled elaborately, her expression solemn beyond her years. At first glance, the portraits seem to celebrate her innocence and beauty, but look closer. The faint protrusion of the lower jaw, the rigidity of her posture, the distant gaze, they are whispers of the hereditary curse, hints of the genetic burden she carried from birth. For Margaret Theresa, there would be no carefree play, no freedom of choice. From her earliest days she was spoken of as a prize, a link in the Habsburg chain, her hand promised to her uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, when she was barely a toddler. It was celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy. To those who cheered, the fact that she was still learning to walk was irrelevant. What mattered was the consolidation of power. She grew up in a gilded cage, her every movement shaped by expectations. Tutors taught her languages, music, and the graceful skills of a noblewoman. Yet none of it was for her own enrichment. These accomplishments were rehearsals, designed to make her more pleasing to her future husband, the man who also happened to be her father's brother. In 1666, at only 15 years old, Margaret Theresa's fate was sealed. She married Leopold in a ceremony of dazzling splendor. The union celebrated across Europe with fireworks, processions, and proclamations. To the world it was a glorious joining of crowns. To Margaret, it was the end of her childhood. The realities of her new life were far from the painted grandeur. Margaret Theresa was expected to immediately bear children, to continue the Habsburg line, but her health was already fragile. Each pregnancy drained her body further. Her first child, a daughter, lived only a few months. Her second pregnancy ended in miscarriage. When she finally bore a son who survived, the court exhaled with relief until it became clear that he too carried the marks of the Habsburg inheritance, his frailty echoing that of his ancestors. The young empress endured pregnancy after pregnancy, her body collapsing under the strain. Physicians noted her pallor, her breathlessness, her fainting fits, her difficulty speaking. Today, doctors would likely diagnose her with severe anemia, epilepsy, and respiratory weakness. But at the time, her suffering was treated as little more than unfortunate circumstance, an obstacle to her, fulfilling her sole purpose: motherhood. By the age of 21, Margaret Theresa's body could endure no more. After years of decline, she died in 1673, officially from fever. In truth, it was exhaustion, the slow collapse of a body weakened by hereditary disease and relentless childbearing. Her death was mourned across the empire, but not for the reasons one might expect. Courtiers and diplomats lamented the loss of potential heirs, of dynastic continuity, of political stability. Few paused to mourn Margaret herself, a young woman whose short life had been consumed by obligations she had never chosen. Yet her legacy endures in those haunting portraits by Velázquez. Behind the silks and the solemnity, the painter captured something more than royal dignity. He captured fragility. He captured a child staring out from the canvas, her small body already bowed under the weight of a dynasty's expectations. Through his brush, we glimpse not the princess Spain wanted her to be, but the girl she truly was, young, burdened, and doomed. Margaret Theresa's story is not merely one of personal tragedy. It is the story of a dynasty that treated daughters as pawns, wives as vessels, and bloodlines as chains of iron. Her life reminds us of the terrible truth hidden beneath the glitter of empire, that crowns were bought at the cost of flesh and blood, and that the price was most often paid by women. Madrid, 1601. Another Habsburg princess is born, her cradle draped in silk, her name destined for power. Anna of Austria, daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria. Like so many before her, she was the product of a union between close kin uncle and niece, and from the start her life was shaped not by her own desires but by the diplomatic chessboard of Europe. At just 14, Anna was taken from her familiar world of Madrid and sent north to a foreign land. She was married to Louis XIII of France, a man she barely knew, a husband chosen not for compatibility, but for the promise of peace between two kingdoms long at war. Her marriage was celebrated with pomp and processions, yet beneath the music and cheers lay a grim reality. A young girl had been transformed overnight into Queen of France, torn from her language, her customs, her family. The French court received her with grandeur, but her position was precarious from the beginning. Louis XIII was distant, cold, and deeply troubled. Modern historians suspect he struggled with depression and inner conflicts that made intimacy nearly impossible. For Anna, this meant a life of isolation within a palace crowded with people. She was surrounded by courtiers yet remained profoundly alone. The expectations placed upon her were cruelly clear. As queen, her worth was measured by her ability to produce sons, yet the genetic inheritance of the Habsburgs had left her frail. Pregnancy after pregnancy ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The court physicians, guided by the limited understanding of their time, subjected her to humiliating treatments, bloodletting, harsh purges, strange dietary regimens. They inspected her with cold detachment, speaking of defects in her feminine nature, as if her failures were her fault. Not once did anyone acknowledge that the fault lay not in Anna herself, but in the generations of cousin marriages that had shaped her very body. As the years passed and no heir appeared, whispers began to circulate through Versailles. Nobles gossiped that she was cursed, that God disapproved of this Spanish match, that France deserved a new queen. Each rumor was a dagger, deepening her despair. Anxiety consumed her. She grew afraid to appear in public, hiding away for days at a time in her private chambers. We would call it agoraphobia now, but then it was merely more fuel for her enemies. Her relationship with Louis deteriorated until they lived nearly separate lives. He, withdrawn into his own struggles, she, retreating further into loneliness. In her solitude, Anna clung to faith. Hours upon hours were spent in prayer, her devotion to Catholic ritual becoming a lifeline in a world that had turned against her. And then, after 23 barren years, a miracle. Against all expectation, Anna gave birth to a healthy son, the future Louis XIV, the Sun King. The entire kingdom erupted in celebration, seeing it as a sign of divine favor. 2 years later, she bore another son, Philippe, securing the succession. For the first time in her life, she was free from whispers of failure. She had fulfilled her duty. Yet triumph did not erase suffering. Decades of anxiety and humiliation had scarred her deeply. Even in her later years, her health remained fragile. Digestive ailments, breathing troubles, and attacks of melancholy that left her bedridden for days. Though she lived to see her son become one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, Anna herself never found peace. She died in 1666, remembered officially as the mother of Louis XIV, but her personal legacy was something far more somber. Her life was the embodiment of what it meant to be a Habsburg daughter, a girl traded for treaties, a queen blamed for infertility, a woman reduced to her womb. The grandeur of Versailles could not disguise the truth that beneath the jewels and titles, Anna was yet another victim of a system that treated women as instruments for dynastic survival. Her story lingers, not as a tale of triumph, but as a warning. She was called queen, but she lived more as a captive, caught between two nations, two dynasties, and a destiny written in her blood. Vienna, 1755. In the glittering court of the Habsburg Empire, a child is born into splendor and expectation. She is christened Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, though history will remember her by another name, Marie Antoinette. The 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor, she enters a world where every daughter is a tool of diplomacy, every marriage a calculated move in the great game of empire. From the beginning, her lineage carried both privilege and peril. Though the union of her parents was not as dangerously close as those of earlier generations, the centuries-long tradition of cousin marriages still lingered in her blood. Her portraits reveal the faint but familiar signs, the lower lip slightly protruding, the subtle suggestion of the Habsburg jaw. Behind her beauty, the shadow of genetic inheritance remained. At the age of 14, Marie Antoinette was dispatched to France, married to the awkward, shy Dauphin, the future Louis XVI. Their union symbolized a grand alliance between Austria and France, once bitter enemies. But beneath the ceremonial carriages, the jewels, and the fireworks, the marriage was fraught from the start. For 7 long years, the union remained unconsummated. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers that the Dauphin was impotent, that Marie herself was cold, that perhaps she was cursed. Court gossip grew cruel, mocking her failures with biting jokes, while pamphlets circulated in Paris painting her as frivolous, foreign, and unfitting to be queen. Yet the truth was far more complex. Louis XVI himself was slow, socially withdrawn, perhaps even developmentally delayed, a young man ill-prepared for the weight of kingship. Marie, still a teenager, struggled with her own anxieties, her body racked with painful menstrual disorders and frequent miscarriages. Both husband and wife bore the burdens of hereditary fragility. Their silence and inexperience became fuel for ridicule. When at last she conceived, her difficulties only deepened. Severe morning sickness, overwhelming anxiety, and what modern doctors might call prenatal depression plagued her pregnancies. Her first daughter, Marie-Thérèse, was born healthy, but subsequent children were not so fortunate. Miscarriages and infant deaths followed, each one etching sorrow more deeply into her heart. Yet the world judged her not with compassion but with scorn. A queen who could not produce sons was a failed queen. The irony was brutal. A woman descended from centuries of arranged marriages meant to preserve dynasties was herself accused of endangering the French line. In pamphlets, she was lampooned as wasteful, decadent, and even accused of monstrous cruelty. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," which she almost certainly never spoke, was invented to cast her as heartless, a queen indifferent to the suffering of her people. In truth, she was deeply sensitive, often overwhelmed by the very despair she was accused of ignoring. As the revolution gathered force, Marie's vulnerabilities only grew more exposed. Observers noted her erratic moods, swings from energetic bursts of activity to deep, immobilizing depression. Modern historians suggest she may have inherited a predisposition to mood disorders common among Habsburg women, worsened by the immense pressure of political collapse. Her judgment faltered, her choices often driven by fear or impulse rather than strategy. By 1793, the French monarchy had fallen. Imprisoned with her children, Marie Antoinette faced interrogations designed to humiliate and break her. Guards reported moments when she seemed lost in confusion, unable to focus, retreating into silence as though withdrawing into some inner refuge. And yet, in the shadow of death, her dignity returned. On October 16th, she was led to the guillotine. The streets of Paris thronged with people, jeering and shouting as she passed. Climbing the scaffold, she reportedly apologized to the executioner for stepping on his foot, a small, human gesture in the face of annihilation. A moment that revealed, perhaps more than anything, the contradiction of her life. Condemned as a monster, yet remembered in her final breath for her courtesy and grace. Her execution ended not only her life but also symbolized the collapse of an entire world order. The Habsburg blood that had been guarded so jealously for centuries could not shield her from the blade. The dynasty that once believed itself chosen by God was undone not by armies alone, but by the frailties and illusions it had cultivated within itself. Marie Antoinette's tragedy lies not in her downfall as queen, but in the burden she carried as a woman born into a broken line. She was at once privileged and powerless, an empress-to-be who could not master her own fate. Her story reminds us that even behind the powdered wigs, the diamonds, and the palaces, there beat a fragile heart, marked by centuries of choices she never made. Madrid, late 17th century. Within the grand walls of the Alcazar Palace, the Spanish court glittered with gold, brocade, and ceremony. Yet behind the curtains, the palace resembled less a royal residence and more a vast infirmary. Here lived the Spanish infantas, the daughters and nieces of Spain's kings, girls born into splendor but destined for suffering. They were the children and grandchildren of Charles II of Spain, the monarch whose inbreeding coefficient was so high that scientists later compared it to the offspring of brother-sister unions. Charles himself was fragile, epileptic, impotent, and childless, but his female relatives bore the weight of the dynasty's decline just as heavily. If Charles was the doomed king, the infantas were his silent shadows, suffering in bodies that never had the strength to carry the crowns placed upon them. Take Maria Margarita, born in 1651. From the beginning, she was slow to develop. She did not walk until long after other children. Her speech was halting, her movements clumsy. Today, physicians might recognize the signs of developmental disorders. But in the 17th century, she was simply another royal daughter, whose fragility was noted in court records with a mixture of concern and resignation. Her sister, Maria Theresa, suffered differently. She endured what physicians of the time called falling sickness, epileptic seizures that left her trembling and weak. Her breathing was labored, her spine twisted, her jaw so malformed she could eat only liquid foods. Each meal was an ordeal, each breath a victory. And yet, despite their obvious frailty, these women were never spared the cruel expectations of dynastic politics. Their marriages were negotiated like treaties, their health reduced to footnotes in diplomatic correspondence. One princess was described in chillingly clinical detail to potential suitors: her seizures, her misshapen jaw, her inability to climb stairs. These were not warnings to protect her, but data points to measure whether she could still serve as breeding stock for a European throne. The most tragic irony was that many of them were married to close relatives yet again. Maria Margherita, fragile as she was, became the wife of Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, the same man who had once been married to her cousin Margaret Theresa. The union was a disaster. She struggled to comprehend her role as wife, and her body was ill-equipped for childbearing. Still, the pressure never lifted. The Alcazar itself became a house of sorrow. Physicians, surgeons, and priests moved constantly through its corridors, tending to one afflicted child after another. Records describe an atmosphere closer to a hospital ward than a royal palace. Fainting spells, seizures, endless prayers for health that never came. Behind every gilded door lay another daughter racked with pain, another mother mourning a miscarriage, another child too weak to play. The psychological toll was just as crushing. The infantas were taught that their worth lay only in bearing heirs. Yet many of them feared pregnancy, knowing it would likely bring death to themselves or to children as fragile as they were. They carried this fear silently, unable to voice it in a world where silence was demanded of women. Letters between royal women reveal heartbreak upon heartbreak. Babies born with deformities who survived only days, infants buried before they were named, miscarriages mourned in secret. These letters are stained with grief that centuries cannot wash away. Worse still, the women often blamed themselves. Without the knowledge of genetics, they could not understand the true cause of their suffering. Instead, they believed their failures were divine punishment, their frailty a personal flaw. They turned to confessionals and prayers, begging God to heal what dynasties had broken. This self-blame added a cruel weight to lives already bowed by pain. The Spanish infantas remind us that the Habsburg curse was not confined to kings and crowns. It lived in the bodies of daughters, sisters, and mothers, who were born only to suffer. Their lives read not like fairy tales of princesses but like case studies in hereditary collapse, written in blood and sorrow. When Charles II died childless in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line ended. His death sparked the War of Spanish Succession, but it also marked the close of a chapter written in human tragedy. The infantas who had endured short, painful lives left behind no healthy heirs, no lasting dynasties. Their bodies, weakened by centuries of inbreeding, had spoken the final word. And in that silence lies the most haunting truth, that for generations of royal daughters, the gilded cradle was also a coffin, and the palace, for all its grandeur, was nothing more than a house of suffering. The story of the Habsburg women is not only a tale of tragedy, it is also a lesson written into the very fabric of history. For centuries, Europe's most powerful families believed their bloodlines were sacred, their purity a divine gift. Yet that same purity became poison. It bent spines, twisted jaws, clouded minds, and broke hearts. The legacy of these women reveals how power, when pursued without compassion, exacts its price not on kings but on the daughters they sacrificed. Today, science gives words to what they endured. We call it inbreeding depression, the accumulation of harmful recessive genes, when close relatives marry generation after generation. In healthy populations, such genes remain hidden, masked by stronger counterparts. But when the pool narrows, those recessive flaws rise to the surface, manifesting as deformities, infertility, mental illness, and early death. The infamous Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, was only the most visible marker of this decline. Beneath it lay epilepsy, depression, immune deficiencies, miscarriages, and untold suffering. And yet, the truth was visible even then. Physicians recorded seizures, deformities, and miscarriages in meticulous detail. Artists painted portraits where the hereditary traits grew more pronounced with every generation. Courtiers whispered of curses. The Catholic Church itself, which could have halted such unions, instead granted dispensations to sanctify them, valuing political power above human health. The cycle repeated, even as evidence mounted. Tradition outweighed reason, blood outweighed love. What makes the story even more haunting is that some of the women themselves, raised to believe their blood was superior, participated in their own undoing. They accepted marriages to cousins or uncles as sacred duty, never realizing that what they preserved was not nobility but fragility. Each generation prayed that their children would be spared, and each generation watched that hope collapse. The cycle finally ended with Charles II of Spain, who died in 1700 without heirs. His body, broken by 16 generations of inbreeding, became the dynasty's final warning. With his death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs vanished, their legacy surviving only in the wars fought over their inheritance. But even in tragedy, something remarkable emerged. The suffering of these women, documented in court records, portraits, and medical notes, became evidence for the science of genetics centuries later. Modern understanding of recessive traits, hereditary disease, and the necessity of genetic diversity owes much to the grim experiment the Habsburgs conducted upon themselves. Their pain was not meaningless, it provided data that helped ensure such mistakes would not be repeated on the same scale. And yet, we cannot reduce them to case studies. Maria Anna of Austria, confined to dim rooms, found refuge in books and learning. Joanna of Castile, branded mad, clung fiercely to love even when it destroyed her. Margaret Theresa, painted as a doll-like bride, bore her burden with dignity until her frail body gave way. Anna of Austria, humiliated and blamed, found solace in faith. Marie Antoinette, condemned by history, walked to her death with courage. The forgotten infantas, frail and silenced, carried the unspoken grief of mothers and daughters who blamed themselves for tragedies they did not cause. Their lives remind us that behind every crown lies a human being, behind every dynasty, a body and soul. These women were not just queens, consorts, or pawns in a political game. They were daughters who wanted affection, wives who longed for loyalty, mothers who prayed for healthy children. They were human beings who deserved compassion but were instead reduced to vessels of bloodline. Their message, echoing across centuries, is as clear as it is urgent, that no pursuit of power, tradition, or ideology should come at the expense of human dignity. That a family tree which refuses to branch will eventually collapse under its own weight. And that true nobility does not lie in blood, but in the recognition of our shared humanity. As we close their stories, return for a moment to that imagined awakening at the beginning, to open your eyes one morning and realize your body, your fate, your very life was shaped by choices made long before your birth. That was the daily reality of these women. They bore the cost of decisions made by ancestors who valued crowns over compassion. And yet, within their suffering lies a paradoxical gift. Their pain became a warning, their lives a testament. Because of them, we know now that bloodline purity is not strength but weakness, not blessing but curse. They could not speak this truth in their own time. But their silence does not erase their voices. Across the centuries, they still whisper, "Remember us," not as queens or pawns. Remember us as women, as human beings who deserved better. And in remembering, we honor them not for the crowns they wore, but for the resilience they showed, even as their blood betrayed them.